Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for another VES-Artex Academy webinar. Today, we are joined by Dan Vanderheiden of DeLaval, and we're really looking forward to the presentation. Before Dan goes ahead and gets started, just one housekeeping item. We will be accepting questions throughout the presentation. So if you have a question, just type it into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom panel on your screen, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So with that, Dan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Annie, and welcome everybody to this presentation. As Annie said, my name is Dan Vanderheiden. I am a solution sales specialist for DeLaval. A little bit on my bio: I live and reside in Wisconsin, near Green Bay. I grew up on a dairy farm. I have a dairy science degree from the University of Wisconsin. I came home from the University of Wisconsin, dairy farmed on my own, along with my wife, of course, for about 10 years before we formed a partnership with some neighbors on a larger dairy. Unfortunately, that partnership over time did not work out, after which some years working for an electrician, I came to DeLaval in 2011. So this is my 12th year with DeLaval. I've had various responsibilities with DeLaval, starting out in 2011, working with the capital side of the business, which is parlors, rotaries, and so forth, with a bit of an emphasis at the time on the calf feeder line. A few years into DeLaval, in 2014, DeLaval acquired a dealership in Kaukauna, Wisconsin. That's near my hometown. I went there for a couple of years to work for DeLaval through 2014 and 2015, coming back to DeLaval corporate in 2016 as a robotic sales specialist, spending the better share of 6 years totally immersed in robotics until the first of 2022 now, where I now have dual responsibilities once again, working with both the rotaries, parlors, and of course retaining responsibilities into robotics for district of Wisconsin and into Minnesota. So once again, welcome. I hope you enjoy this presentation, and feel free to ask questions anytime throughout the presentation. I've kind of named this presentation, nicknamed it Rotaries and Robots. And even though despite the majority of cows in the United States, they still being milked in parallel and herringbone parlors, and even still quite a number of cows being milked in stall barns or some type of step up or flat barn parlor, we're going to concentrate today's talk on robots and rotaries, because that is really the primary theme that producers want to discuss as they look toward the future. So next, we're going to do a little bit of an agenda as to what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover in our agenda a short history on robotics in the United States, a little bit of a recent timeline explanation of dairy herd expansions in the United States, how labor affected that, how we got to kind of where we are today, labor history in dairy, and labor's created, some opportunities, labor's created challenges, and the new labor challenges we have are creating new opportunities. So really, labor's the thread of the presentation. That's because of its inconsistency and availability, and that's really what drives the change in the industry. So we'll explore beyond that a little bit more, rotary opportunities, robotic opportunities. We'll explore some hybrid rotary robotic opportunities, and then we'll do some reviewing, explanation of some financial considerations of robots and or rotaries. And of course, we'll have some time towards the end for questions that are not covered as we go through the presentation. So robot review in US history. Robotic milking in the U.S. really dates back to the year 2000 and the new millennium when Carnegie Farms, just south of me here in Amro, Wisconsin, was the first dairy farm in the U.S. to take the leap into robotic milking with a couple of Lely Astronaut A2 units. So in the picture here, we have Theo, and we have Pete, Charlie, and Charlie's son, Jacob. I personally know this family. They're great ambassadors for the dairy industry. DeLaval, on the other hand, entered into the U.S. robotic milking market several years later. But as history would have it, about the same time that the Carnegie family in the summer of 2000 were starting their two A2 Lely's, there was the family in the Netherlands, the Van Kempen, Van Diepenbeek family started milking with DeLaval. So both primary robotic milking brands have an extensive history in the development and deployment of robotics. So a little bit of history of robotics. In the early years of robotic milking in the United States, it was very, very much a European inspired in both barn design and cow management. Of course, most of the first robots, that influence came from Europe. Robots really developed in Europe. Barns were designed for robots, and cows were managed around the barn design. The early adapters thought about milking with robots, really more or less from a lifestyle adaptation vision. People enjoyed milking cows. They wanted to, wanted just a little more flexibility in their schedule, so to speak, when milking cows, and robotics looked very attractive to the early adapters of robotics. From that standpoint, it would give them more flexibility in their work schedule. Oftentimes, this would tend to be smaller farms, primarily with the family providing the labor almost exclusively. And then the return on investment premised upon the exchange of capital upfront in lieu of labor paid over time. In other words, you're kind of forward paying labor with robots. That was really the premise that robots were founded on. That is definitely the premise that we worked with early on when we talked to financial institutions on the return on investment and how we were going to pay for robotics, because of course the capital outlay up front for robotics is substantially more than some of the other systems that we use to harvest milk. I highlight this point on this slide up front as it's going to become a real interesting point later in discussion, so I just wanted to highlight it now, and we'll return to this later. Robotics kind of updated now. They've been around, of course, 20 years or so in the United States, and the more modern concept of designing robot barns has really changed. Now, through time, learning robot barns are more designed around individual management preferences, and that has really become the norm. Larger barns have more flexibility in incorporating some management preferences into the barn design, especially in terms of grouping. So the difference being, as I said the previous slide, barns were you were kind of given this cookie cutter barn and said, here's your barn, manage around it. This is kind of how we manage these barns. Today, we're looking at talking to producers, say, okay, what's your management style? What's your management preferences and so on? And we're trying to design the barn around their management preferences now versus the other way around. Lifestyle considerations are still a very important part in many a dairyman's considerations when they're looking at, do I put in rotaries, do I put in robots, do I put in some kind of other milk harvesting system? But the business principles have become much more a dominant consideration when we're looking now at putting in robot barns and part of that decision. The return on investment is still premised upon that exchange of capital up front in lieu of labor paid over time. And DeLaval now in the world has installations from, as small as a single robot to more than 80 robots on a single installation. I'll discuss as we move along here how robots can fit conceptually and practically in the future of larger farms a little bit later in the presentation. Now I want to take a few minutes and just kind of review the evolution, not only conventional milking equipment, but more importantly, the thoughts, the concepts, the reasoning, and so forth behind this evolution over the past few decades. Really, except for perhaps size, the dairy equipment that we use for harvesting milk has really not changed that much. However, the size and number of dairy farms have changed dramatically. Well, really, the total number of dairy cows has remained relatively consistent. No disrespect at all, for sure, intended on the conventional inline parlors is still milk, the vast majority of cows yet today. But again, just today, when we're talking to dairymen, looking at planning the future, it's the question of robots or rotaries or the two used in combination, automation, and so forth that really dominate the conversation as we're looking forward. And that's really the focus of today's conversation. So I grew up in the Midwest, so I'll look at this with a little bit of a Midwest perspective, but realizing that, this has been the same throughout the United States. Western United States is a little ahead of us in a lot of the same concepts, but this is kind of in the mid 90s, 93, 94, 95. We've seen a lot of this on Wisconsin and other Midwestern state dairy farms. You have like a picture here of a new parlor, or maybe this is a parlor addition. Same thing with the freestall barn next to it. A lot of new freestall barns going up, or expanded freestall barns. And, I'm going to get into a little bit as to why that was and why that time period in our history. So to really have a good discussion, I like to go back and just, kind of look at history a little bit, early mid 90s, looking at a little bit of the evolution of the entire industry. So next year we have just one of those typical Midwest dairy farm expansion stories. As you can see here, there's the big red barn in the back, and then there was a piece added on here a little later to milk a few more cows. Started with about 40, added about 140 cows. Then a freestall barn out back here to milk another 50, 60, maybe even 100 cows. Some of these farms, they put parlors on. Some would milk in flat barns and so forth. But the idea was expanding. And why did dairymen at that point in time really want to start expanding? Well, so let's discuss that a little bit. And really the reason expansion really came about in that time frame, in that early mid 90s out in the western part of the United States, more that mid 90s working towards the new millennium in the Midwest, so forth, is we had a labor pool suddenly. I remember on the dairy, carloads of potential employees would show up, weekly, sometimes even more than that. At the time, that the industry almost had what seemingly was an endless supply of labor. It wasn't a perfect labor pool by any means, as we had challenges to work with some of the employment legality, some of the housing challenges, but there certainly was an ample supply at the time. So what does this, almost seemingly endless labor pool, what did that mean for the dairy industry? Well, it gave us opportunity people have been looking at for quite some time, people that wanted to expand the dairy and milk more cows, but just didn't have the labor, or the family wasn't large enough to have labor. So suddenly we had labor, we had this pool, it created this opportunity to expand, but still, to some reasonable degree, the question was, okay, why expand? Well, there was this word, efficiency. And efficiency is one of those buzzwords that have been around, forever, basically meaning, we're going to do more with the same amount of labor, maybe more with less. It's always been a business buzzword, other industries, including our industry, but in a very labor intense industry, such as milking cows, labor was always a limiting factor regarding expansion, economies of scale, and so forth as a means to efficiency. But now suddenly we had labor, and as the labor pool, changed and expanded, we had more opportunities to become more efficient in the dairy industry. For a long period of time, decades, even now today, it was difficult to pick up an egg magazine, an academic publication, and we'd see that word all the time: efficiency. Headlines in magazines, different universities, extensions, so forth, talked about efficiency. That was the way to stay in the dairy industry. How were we going to survive looking forward in the dairy industry? Same as we do now. We're always questioning what's next. How are we going to be sustainable in this industry? These same questions were being asked at that point in time, and labor was a key to it. Labor still is a key to it today. So efficiency, really second only to labor, and the pursuit of efficiency probably has driven expansion more than anything. Ask a dairyman 30 years ago today, why they want to add cows. Number one answer still is to increase efficiency. And just for me, efficiency is one of those interesting theories. You can chase it, and we're always chasing efficiency, but you never quite catch it. You can become more efficient, but you can never become totally efficient. What is totally efficient? But I digress. So we're going to talk a little bit more now what constitutes efficiency. So forever in parlor barns, efficiency was cows per stall point per day. So we designed these barns to get the maximum number of milkings per stall point per day, and that was considered efficient. So if we could run a parlor 21, 22 hours a day and leave a couple hours for washing and maximize the cost, that was efficiency. And still to a large extent today, that is a definition of efficiency. But later in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about how some of that thought process is changing. That will always be the case to some degree, is that cows per stall point is efficiency, but it's not defined as rigidly now from that standpoint as maybe it was even 10 or 15 years ago. Then, of course, for years and years and years, the chase of efficiency combined with really the absence of a supply control, that's really what helped fuel expansions. It's not that many years ago, if you were planning an expansion, the question of whether or not you had a market for the additional milk, that question was never asked. It was just assumed it would be there. But my, how times have changed. Now we go to a lender, we want to expand. The first question is, do you have a market for that milk? Because without that, there isn't, much sense in even having the conversation. We need a market. However, there's an old saying that holds true for everything, of course. As time passes, things change. So we've kind of taken a look back, over the last 3 decades, and now we're kind of moving through that as time passes and changes to where we are today to, really get to the root of the discussion. So what's changed? People, of course, or more to the point, labor. People are our greatest resource. We cannot operate this industry, or most any industry for that matter, without people. So what's the change? So we have competition for the same labor pool at the same time, and the expansion of this labor pool over the years started to slow down, and even to some degree started shrinking. And as depicted by the chart, here, ag had the lowest compensation rate for supplied labor. And we're trying to divide this labor, amongst all these other industries, construction, manufacturing, transportation, and so forth. In addition to that, you take, any resource that has greater demand and smaller supply, of course, the cost is going to go up. It has some non-economic benefits. Unfortunately, a lot of visa programs don't work for farm milkers. We've had that huge increase in the cost of labor. And there's obviously a quantity and, of course, a quality crisis in the available labor pool. Just a quick stat here, only 1.5% of the labor force in the United States works in ag. So it's really part of the changing dynamics of the available labor pool. Most notably, the change over the last 10 years or so in the demographics of where these people were coming from. The countries of origin for a lot of these employees have had strong changes in their local demographics. Some of these countries are better financially, things are better at home than maybe what they were 10 or 15 years ago. Immigration policy, of course, has changed the availability to the labor pool. So just kind of a summarize as to what has been and where we're headed. Kind of the foundation story to our consideration discussion, or the backstory. We've established, that labor, or the inconsistency of labor, for a better description, is a major driving force in the evolvement of the dairy industry. So labor created the opportunities, and now labor, or the lack of labor, really has created some challenges, but with challenges comes opportunities. And that's really where we're going to get into our conversation of bots or rotaries. So why rotaries? And, why robots? Why are those the two we're discussing? What are these challenges? Where do we go? So if you look at robots and rotaries, they are generally accepted as the two most labor efficient present day milk harvesting options. They're also generally accepted to be the two options with the most potential for technology adaptation and labor reduction through automation processes, either already part of the equipment or, potentially that we can add on to that equipment. They seem to be the preferred options of employees for a work environment. And lastly, but maybe even most importantly, is most research and development funding is being targeted towards robots and rotaries. The labor dynamics on a dairy farm, been a real paradigm shift. When I look at here and talk about conventional milking, these are facts and figures taken from parallels, herringbones, and some, throw in some flat barn parlors, milking barns, so forth. This is kind of the labor dynamic between that group of milk harvesting equipment and robotic milking. And then if you were going to put rotary into this picture, it would fall somewhere in between. But as you can see, there's just been a huge shift in how time is spent on dairies managing the business end of it or the milk harvesting end of it. So now I'm going to take some time and just look at benefits of each of rotaries or robots, kind of in a one versus the other scenario for a little bit. Or so why rotaries? Well, rotaries are the most direct replacement in relation to present facilities. So in your style. So now if you're milking with, whatever the parallel parlor might be, or your herringbone parlor, you have a double 20, 30, 40, what have you, replacing that with a rotary is the most similar in in the management style that you're having now. So you'll continue to bring the cows up from the barn, probably still continue to scrape while the cows are up. Everything in the schedule is going to be still really consistent on that 8-hour shift or 12-hour shift, that kind of thing. So we're really just replacing the milking center with something that still really fits our traditional or management style that we're comfortable with. This is really for the operator that likes their present management style, really needs or wants to milk more cows, or perhaps just their present facility is old and tired, and they're looking for labor efficiency and or a better environment for their employees, but really don't want to change the rest of the management style on their farm. There's a fair amount of expansion flexibility with rotaries. You need to pay for the entire rotary, of course, up front, but there are opportunities to oversize that rotary for what you're milking now with future expansion in mind. So there's plenty of expansion flexibility from that standpoint. Adaptation to technology is definitely more flexible towards rotaries than it is the more traditional inline parlors. And of course, the initial capital expenditures I already mentioned, that needs to take place pretty much up front. Again, talking a little bit about technologically adaptability to a rotary. It lends itself very well. Pictures we have here, we have a DeLaval branded teat spray robot, and next to it here we have a competitive teat dipping system. Both will fit, both will work on pretty much any rotary that there is. So we can look at putting one of these pieces of equipment to post dip cows. That will eliminate one person on the deck for labor, and using the same technology, we can, depending on the management or style of the farm or how they are prepping their cows, we can also use automation like this to pre-dip cows on a rotary parlor, thus again potentially eliminating one more unit of labor on the rotary. We discussed robots or rotaries. How about robots on rotaries? This is a concept that's well accepted in theory. Although the practical application has been very expensive and has had its share of challenges, mostly with higher maintenance, slowing the adaptation, but still a very well accepted, in theory, thought about, how can we use high amounts of automation combined with the speed of rotaries, both technologies that are well employed today, how can we use them together? So this particular example still requires one employee serving as a roamer when the unit is in operation. Second thought of doing the same situation, this is a DeLaval AMR that we have sold in some European countries and so forth. So this, rather than putting robotic equipment on every stall, we're going to use robotic equipment on the external of the rotary, or to be task specific. So that adaptability, you would have, a couple of robots, perhaps 2 of them cleaning, doing pre-milking, pre-stripping type of work. You'd have a couple of robots perhaps doing attaching, and then you'd have one robot just doing the teat spring. So in the case of perhaps 5 or 6 robots, you could do all the automation work that needs to be done to prep, attach, and post dip from a rotary versus having automation on every stall. So that's really a discussion going forward, is what's the most economical way of doing this. This will be the discussion, the future of robots and rotaries. Which is the least maintenance? Which is the most flexible, allowing for next generation technological advancements? Is it more economical for future technological advancements to only have 5 to 7 robot arms to change versus, an entire deck full? Time and technological advance will tell us the answer to that question. Another concept we're really starting to look at and work with is smaller rotaries for some dairies with automation, capable of limited employee operation. So if we were to look at perhaps a 30, 40, or even a 50 stall smaller rotary, adapt technologies such as post-dip sprayers, pre-dip sprayers, and so forth on these decks, with these decks running slower. Like a 40 stall, for example, it's about 18 seconds a cow as that goes around. There are opportunities definitely to run these decks with 2 people, and there may even be some opportunity to run these decks with a single person without adding automation in every stall. So the opportunity, with the rotary is really nice because we can adjust the rotary speed to accommodate a single operator, with some sort of wipe and attach routine. May be a very economical opportunity. We may not run that rotary at its most efficient speed, may run a little bit slower, but that trade-off between labor and speed and investment may well be a very worthwhile discussion to have, and maybe a very economical discussion to have as we move forward. So now we'll look at a little bit robots from the same standpoint. What are the advantages to robots, perhaps? So again, robots have some flexibility, expansive flexibility. Put the robots in that are needed to milk the number of cows we have today, and as you want to do expansions, we can consider adding robots. You're not paying for all technology today, you pay for the technology as you go along. Allows for a lot of technology adaptability. We're just not sure what that technology might be. Today we have things like smart pulsation, individual quarter metering, flow control milking, cow side sampling technology works extremely well with robotics. So, and what I mean by cow side sampling and collection is like progesterone. We can collect progesterone today to look at is that cow pregnant, or look at where she is in her cycle, and so forth. We can pinpoint breeding times based off of a milk progesterone sample versus using some of the other heat detection technologies. There's some flexibility in putting robots in barns. So traditionally we think of a robot per 60 to 65 cows, but remember that's based on 3 times a day average milkings per cow. We have dairies that will adjust that now to maybe it's the entire farm, or maybe it's a certain pen, or we move cows around to a certain pen where we look at, maybe more cows per box, but with the understanding that we're only going to get perhaps a 2.5 average milkings per day per cow for that farm, or maybe it's just a group of cows, and so forth. But there's a lot of flexibility where we can tailor the robots to what is needed on that farm. So perhaps the farm with variable pen sizes, there's definitely some opportunity there to adapt to what you have or what is needed at the farm. The amount of data available from a box robot today is incredible. So a dairyman who really likes, needs, and wants to use technology, robots are a great opportunity for them. labor-friendly working conditions. For labor really likes to work with robots. You know, it's not as monotonous as standing, obviously, in one position for hours on end. Box robots are incredibly cow-friendly. I mean, you have that word voluntary. Cows voluntarily do what they want when they want and at what time of day. It's very friendly to the cow. She sets her pace, and due to this, we've seen from some cow longevity studies that we'll see a half a lactation increase on a lot of cows. What does that mean? Of course, there's a lot of variables that go into what that means per cow per year, but I don't think $200 a cow per year in increased net profitability per cow is really that far off. So that's something to think about as well, cow longevity. You know, labor's still the driving influence, but today, especially to a younger, very data-driven, cow-focused producer, box robots can be the ideal solution. You know, labor savings are realized, they're a bit variable, but they're realized through labor savings. Labor flexibility, again, we talked about that a little bit earlier, very important when the labor force is primarily family supplied. Challenges of robots versus box robots versus maybe rotaries is the initial capital expenditure is always going to be larger. It requires experienced technical specialists, often on the farm payroll as you start getting in some of these larger installations. And the maintenance cost per hundredweight is usually a bit higher compared to conventional systems. But still, when we look at doing return on investment with labor savings, oftentimes we can overcome these higher costs for maintenance with some labor savings. So now we've done some review. We've looked at robots. We've looked at rotaries. We've even looked at robots on rotaries. Are there still other opportunities for robots and automation? Glad you asked. A very recent concept, but a concept being looked at very closely right now is batch milking. Again, very similar to rotaries. It's a direct replacement in relation to the present facilities and the management style. So what we're really looking to do here is where we would normally place a parlor, or maybe where we would normally place a rotary, we would put box robots lined up in a group and still physically bring the cows to the milk harvesting equipment, much the same as we would with a traditional parlor or a rotary parlor. So therefore, a lot of the management situations, management styles will remain very similar to what is already employed on the farm or what the dairyman is comfortable with. But now we're getting some of the advantages of robotics in that situation. You have all the options. You have the huge amount of data gathering from robots that's available in this situation. Reduction in labor, of course, but still the more traditional, comfortable management style, just because that's the way the farm is comfortable with management, or maybe it's just the layout of the farm just dictates that putting robots in barns will not work. This is definitely an alternative. Next, we'll look at some automated milking systems kind of using a hybrid model. And what I mean by using a hybrid model is we'll target an automated system to one group for maximum effect or outcome. And this is done a fair amount now with farms where we already have milking systems in place. Perhaps we have a rotary that's been maxed out, but the farm still has the ability to expand. They already have a feed system, a north system, etc. A lot of the other stuff already in place, but they still want to add cows to become more efficient. Well, maybe we'll put a robot barn on that facility in addition to the existing milking equipment, and then just target those robots with a certain group of cows. Perhaps it's fresh cows, and try to take advantage of that maximum number of times per day milking. Or we can put fresh cows on there because of all the automation on robots. We can do a great job of monitoring and automatic feed supplementation. Reproduction group, perhaps on robots, trying to take advantage of milk progesterone monitoring. Supplemental milking facilities in a situation where primary milking system has reached its potential. A lot of times adding robots instead of another milking center just fits that farm's layout a lot better. I mean, it fits their management style a lot better. So we have a lot of different opportunities with both rotaries and robots and putting them together. How do we, arrive at a decision? All this technology, all this stuff available to us. If I'm going to a farm, how do we, look at or arrive or talk about features, benefits, what's best for some of these farms? So when I go to a farm, what I like to do is look at my discussion with a dairyman or a prospect as kind of a job interview process, so to speak. Try to review their current management style, get a feel for what's really important to them. How do they benchmark their dairy? What makes them successful? I like to have conversations of what the farm structure is and what their vision. Is there a next generation? Is that next generation looking at operating or managing that farm different than what it is presently today? What's the importance or the need of expansion to meet their future goals? I really like to look at farms on 5, 10, 15, even 20-year goals, and then continue to develop and understand that vision and look at that ultimate 15, 20 year from now vision and start to work backwards as to what they want and where they are today, and put forward a plan. How do we get there? Personally, I enjoy probably that part of the sales process as much as anything. Sitting down, getting a vision, meeting that vision, doing the construction goals and so forth, and seeing the success that comes with that is a lot of satisfaction for me personally. When we talk about robotic milking, robots are paid by two things. The first, of course, is milk production gains, and the second is labor savings. That's really what it comes down to. Labor rates and efficiencies change so much that please don't use the numbers on these sheets as fact, but the relationship difference in labor per cost per 100 from what I'm showing here is definitely possible. This entire scenario is based on different individual farm parameters, so this will be different for every farm, but there's definitely opportunities where robotic milking can be more economical than conventional milking. We talked earlier on the new contemporary considerations, as I like to call it, and this is where I came with the name for calling this contemporary considerations of modern milking technology, is really this next thought. So early in the presentation, I talked about this bold statement here on the bottom of the ROI is premised upon the exchange of capital upfront in lieu of labor paid over time for robotics. And that is very true then, it's still very true now, but this has been a premise with robots pretty much since we started selling robots. Now the question for me really is this premise, this thought of the return on investment based on exchange of capital up front in lieu of labor over time, is that really limited to robots? So in this next slide, I'd really like to explore that. So here is a very contemporary thought, decision, discussion we should be having is, and I'm going to take a 400 cow example here, for instance. It takes about 6 robots to milk 400 cows. We could also milk those same 400 cows with a small rotary. 6 robots, the cost would be approximately $1.2 million. A 40 stall rotary installed would be approximately $1.2 million. The concept here, of course, with robots has been long accepted that we're going to put that capital expenditure up front to save labor. More and more today, we're also looking at that same premise with rotaries, spending that extra money up front to perhaps only have to milk cows 2 or 3 hours, 3 times a day. You know, it's not that long ago that we put a rotary in, you thought you had to run it better share 24 hours a day. But why not use that same thought process, the same premise of spending the capital up front to save labor over time? Can we use that same thought process with rotaries? And I think we can. I think it's a very important and a very good conversation to have. You know, dairies with 400 cows trying to rely on family labor. 40 stall rotary to milk 175 cows an hour. Do we look at 2.5 hours in a rotary and then have the rest of the day free to do the rest of the chores? Or, you know, dairies hiring labor. You know, are there labor available in 3-hour increments? You know, perhaps it's high school kids or people that just want to work part-time. You know, what are the opportunities to maybe look at that same premise as far as financing? And how do we know? What are our opportunities? What are tools that are out there to help us look at and determine where some of the return is on investments, or do a comparable comparison? Well, and I'm sure, you know, other consultants have tools as well, but here at DealAval, we've developed a proprietary spreadsheet to do a comparative analysis based on, you know, different data with prospect supplied data. So in this example, I'm going to compare perhaps a pit parlor that's already on the farm, a current system for reference. And then we'll look at, you know, what would a new parlor cost us? And then perhaps let's look at a rotary, a 40 stall rotary, or, you know, and then in the end, we'll compare it with perhaps 6 robots, and we'll put in different things like, you know, the initial capital costs. We'll look at what are your labor costs and so forth, and try repair, supply costs, performance, and all of that, and try to arrive at some kind of return on asset based on dollars per hundredweight outcome, and compare these two as they go across. Of course, I don't have any data in here, but this is a tool that we would use to try to compare and help with decision making. And then before we get to questions, I have one last consideration that I would just like to speak to, and then we'll go to questions. And that one last consideration now is, as we think about what we do moving forward, how, what systems do we choose to milk cows? How does that affect the consumer? How much do our decisions and choices affect consumer decisions, and how does that reflect back on us? Our box robotics more humane in the eye of the consumer. That word voluntary is, means a lot to the consumer. It's a one word with, potential huge connotations for the right target. Would one milk harvesting system affect the consumer buying habits and willingness to pay a premium? I don't want to do any name dropping, but I did have a meeting once with a large marketer that expressed a willingness to pay a premium from box robot produced milk, as the perception as he's seen it was that it was more humanely produced. I know we're in an industry with incredibly tight margins, and the luxury of perhaps catering to a segment of the market may be difficult, but we can't lose sight of who our customer is. We look at the alternatives that have been out there for the dairy segment, the milk, your almond milk, your soy milk, your oat milk, and so forth. But they've all have disrupted the fluid milk market at some point, but they've all given back market share to the next alternative, and even ceded back market share, as they all seem to be, fads in the industry, and they've had limited sustainability. So us as an industry, how do we look at this? Just wanted to, before I ended this, just put that out there. How important is that? How, where do we look at this moving forward? I've known several dairies who do some niche milk marketing, and that's very important to them as to what the consumer, how the consumer looks at it. So we're going to wrap up this with a similar theme as to when we started. It's all about the people, or perhaps the lack of people. At that point, if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Thanks so much, Dan. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I just wanted to put in a quick plug for our next webinar, which will be on September 9th. It will be with Hugh McConaughey of Zinpro, and he'll be talking about an environment for healthy, productive, and long-lived cows. So we hope everyone's able to join us. But we do have one question that's came in so far. Kind of, I think, more gauging your opinion, but what type of advancements and additions do you expect in automatic milking in the future?
I expect the advancements moving forward in automatic milking from an equipment standpoint to be concentrated in the area of cow prep and cow attach. We already have fairly good technology for monitoring that cow as she milks, and for a post dip and even a pre-dip. But technology is probably still a little bit lacking that is economical in the prep and attach of equipment. So that's from the equipment standpoint. From the other standpoint, technology is wide open in the area of cow side type monitoring. The advancements being made in stuff like rumination monitoring or progesterone testing, temperature detection, just a whole host of other opportunities that is wide open and will continue to expand at a very rapid rate. Stuff that'll monitor what cows' health is for us.
So how much more feed efficiency can we expect to get from robots going forward?
We've seen at least 1/10 of a point in feed efficiency reduction in robots. And where that comes from, if you think about robots versus a conventional system where cows need to go up to a holding area, that trek and it depends, it varies by farm, of course. That trek to the holding area, that time spent in the holding area is very energy robbing and not a really advantageous situation to be in. Whereas a box robot barn, that cow doesn't have to expend that energy going to the milking center. Her energy is expended a little bit more efficiently.
I don't see any more questions, so we'll see if any more roll in again. But during this time, I just again wanted to thank you, Dan, very much for your presentation.
Absolutely.
And thank everyone for joining. Oh, we do have one question that just came in, and this will probably potentially be our last one. So oftentimes larger dairies have less cost per hundredweight than smaller farms because of efficiency. Smaller farms seem to be going to robots more than the larger farms. If smaller farms are able to install robots and turn a profit better than if they had a parlor, would this effect not carry over into the larger herds?
Well, yes, efficiency has been the name of the game for 30 years. That's the holy grail for being sustainable, is the efficiency. So if a smaller farm can be more sustainable with robotics, or for that matter, if a larger farm can be more sustainable with robotics, we're definitely going to see robotics employed in both sides of these farms. It's just automation will make that difference. It's just, what's it going to look like? Is it going to look like box robots, or are we discussing automation arms to make a more conventional system, so to speak, our rotary more efficient?
What's the cost and upkeep of robots, and how long are they lasting?
Well, we have robots now that have lasted in excess of 15 years. So if you do your maintenance, really the sky's the limit on how long these robots will last. I don't know of any of them that have been taken out because they're worn out, so to speak, if the maintenance is done. Reason robots are coming out and being exchanged at this point is just because of the speed of technology, more than robots wearing out. To answer the other question, as far as maintenance, that will vary a fair amount farm to farm based on a handful of things. One is a sand barn versus a non-sand barn. Sand barns definitely will be higher maintenance costs. How much labor does the producer want to put in of his own towards the maintenance of that versus having somebody from the dealership come will affect that tremendously. But as a general rule, on a per hundredweight basis, the maintenance costs in box robotic milking systems, whichever color you want to look at, is still higher than what it is for conventional milking systems, whether it's parallels, herringbones, or even rotaries on a per hundredweight basis.
All right, I think that's our last question. So thank you everyone so much again, and I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thanks everybody. Appreciate you coming to the webinar.